Good evening, one and all. Today, we have another hour helping of horror to indulge in. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was 10 years old and just started 5th grade. I had made a new friend in school, Janie. My parents allowed me to go for a sleepover at her house, even though they'd only met her mother once. And my mum and dad were pretty laid back, because I was their last child, and my sisters were 9 and 13 years older than me. So my mum dropped me off, said hello to Janie's mum, and left. Me and Janie started playing karaoke when her mum decided that she was going to leave. She said goodbye to us, gave us kisses on the cheek, and I remember that she smelled a bit like black licorice. Me and Janie were left to do whatever we wanted for the next 5 hours. Janie's older sister came home around 1 AM and told us that we should be going to bed because we were falling asleep on the couch, and so we went into Janie's room and laid in her bed. Later that night, I can't be sure what time it was because it was pitch black, but Janie's mum came home. I woke up to a pounding sound on Janie's bedroom door. I started yelling in fear when I felt a hand cover my mouth. It was Janie telling me to be quiet and pretend to be asleep. But at that moment, it was too late. Her mother had kicked in the door. She stormed over to the bed and grabbed Janie's face. She began screaming at Janie because we accidentally left the TV on. I was trying to hide under the covers, but she saw me, and she began slamming her fists on the bed around me and screamed, "You think you're better than me?" over and over. I was sobbing and all I could think about was going home. I was so scared and I begged her mum to let me call my parents because I felt sick. Her mum, though, grabbed my chin, looked me in the eyes and said, "I know what you're doing, little girl, and you aren't going anywhere until I say you can." She stormed out of the room, slamming the half-broken bedroom door behind her. Janie said nothing, and neither did I. Needless to say, I did not sleep that night, and in the morning when I went to call my mother, Janie's mother was on the phone. She wouldn't let me use it even though I asked multiple times, and finally when she was going to take a shower, I heard her pass the phone over to Janie's sister and said, "Don't let that little bitch use this phone. If you do, I ain't buying you cigarettes anymore." I was a sheltered kid, and at the time I overheard that, I knew that I had to get out of there. I approached Janie's sister, and she basically threw the phone at me. She was ready to give it to me before I even asked for it, and with a look of fear in her eyes, she said, "My mum is calling her guy, so you need to call home now." And so I did. She saved my life, and I still believe it to this day. Was her guy someone who was going to come and get rid of me? I shudder at the thought. The rest of the story isn't very exciting. My mother picked me up and I acted like nothing was wrong. 2 days later though, it was Parents' Day. Janie was in my class, which meant her mother was there as well. Her mother approached me and asked me why I never wanted to come over anymore, and she accused me of being a mean girl. She was talking to me in a way that seemed harmless, therefore wasn't obvious to my mum or teacher. I kept my mouth shut and didn't say a word. But 2 weeks later, my older sister was babysitting me whilst our parents were at the movies, and I broke down and told her what happened because I couldn't stop thinking about it. She comforted me and told my parents. We hugged each other and cried. A couple of weeks later, Janie stopped coming to school. My classmates wondered what happened, and so did I. I didn't want to ask my parents what happened. 15 years later, I heard from Janie on Facebook. There was no life-changing conversation, but we did exchange pleasantries. I suppose that's life sometimes. So crazy, alcoholic, abusive mother, let's never meet again. I grew up in a really safe city in the Midwest, in an even safer neighborhood, sort of set back in the woods and separated from the main part of town. I haven't had a lot of creepy encounters in my short life, so this one is pretty much the most afraid I've ever been. I was 11 at the time, and had only just passed my CPR babysitting essential course at the rec. My neighborhood was very close-knit. All of the kids on my street played together, and because of my 2 younger brothers, I would soon become the automatic babysitter for the 3 families we lived closest to. I looked after my brothers for short amounts of time, but this was my first real job as a babysitter. I watched these 2 grade school age kids who lived across the street. They were family friends, and the parents had promised that they would be home by 11 PM, and I knew that my parents were home and ready to step in if I needed anything. So I wasn't a little nervous, but felt like I had things under control. These kids were a novice babysitter's dream. They'd been trained that they were only allowed to choose 1 treat each before bed, and actually refused my offer to let them finish the show we were watching because it was their bedtime, and they still needed to brush their teeth first. I was floored, but it made my job super easy, so I tucked them in and headed back downstairs to watch TV until their parents returned. The mother was an interior designer, so their house was spacious and absolutely beautiful. Their living room is at the back of the house with floor-to-ceiling windows and is a great view of the woods into their backyard. The couch is set up so it backs onto these windows, and I was watching TV with their elderly white Labrador, Alex. Suddenly though, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something large and light-coloured brush past the window behind me. I thought it might just be a deer, but I was 11 and alone, and I have an active imagination. So I began to feel uneasy and pretty on edge. The parents weren't due back for another 2 hours, so I walked into the kitchen to call my mum and dad for reassurance. Alex followed. Their kitchen faces the living room, with the house phones on the counter, as this was before cell phones happened. Standing at the counter dialing my parents, I had a clear view through the broad archways into the living room, and out of those enormous windows into the backyard. Alex laid down at my feet, as I stood next to the counter, and told my mum that I thought I'd seen something out the window. Hearing her voice was comforting and reassuring, as I thought it would be, so I told her that no, I didn't need Dad to come over, and that yes, I'd call for her if I needed anything at all. I hung up the phone and sat down on the floor to rub Alex's ears and belly for a few minutes. I was still kind of wary of the living room. I hadn't been there too long before I caught a glimpse of something odd outside those giant windows. I looked harder, past the glare of the TV, and noticed a tiny, bobbing light moving around the woods. Probably just a neighbour, I thought. But as I watched, the light seemed to be moving into what was undeniably my direction. My whole body froze, and I stared as the light as it got closer and closer to the living room windows. and at some point I realised that, complete with paralysing horror, the light had grown large enough for the source to be right outside the house. The beam swung from one side of the living room to the other, and then settled directly on my face. I don't even think I squinted into the bright light that shone through the window into my eyes. I was startled. Alex snoozed, placid in his old age, and entirely unaware that my heart had pretty much stopped beating. The light moved again, this time swinging away to illuminate a face from underneath. I saw dark, hollow eye sockets and the glowing curves of someone's cheeks, but the facial details were lost into the harsh angle of the flashlight beam. At this point I was trying with all my might to scream, or to move my fingers enough to dial 911, or move out of my view of the window. Literally anything would have been better than sitting there with my mouth open and tears in my eyes like a stuffed turkey. But I'd never felt this kind of icy terror before. I was completely immobilized by it. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, and I was totally powerless. The light swung around to point at me, then quickly moved back underneath to the horrible face outside. It repeated this pattern once or twice more, and then suddenly disappeared. The flashlight had been turned off, and for whatever reason that was finally enough to let me move again. I quickly stood there and hit dial, about to call 911, as I mentally debated whether to get up there to the master bedroom with the children, or just grab them and try and run out the front door to my parents' house. The rec class had not prepared me for this. Before I even got as far as the foyer and dialed the first one, I heard a loud boom and felt my gut leap into my throat as I realised I remembered to close the main garage doors that locked the door from the garage to the laundry room, but I couldn't remember locking the main doors from the garage to their backyard. I almost dropped the phone as someone began pounding on the interior door. Through the pounding though, I could hear a voice. A really, really familiar voice. "Mavis? Mavis? It's Dad. Let me in." I stumbled over completely numb and unlocked the door. My dad could hardly stand up. He was laughing so hard. Apparently my mum had sent him over anyway to check on me to make sure there was nothing to be afraid of. He had done a quick sweep of the woods in the backyard, with a flashlight under the assumption that Mum had mentioned that he'd been coming over to me. He saw me through the window and attempted to show me it was him by pointing at me and then shining the light on his face. Under his freaking face. He was unaware that the shadows made it impossible for me to tell who he was until he saw the colour drain from my face and realised that he'd just given me the scare of my life. He thought it was pretty funny. I didn't really agree. I really thought I was about to get all kinds of murdered. But I'm so glad it was a false alarm. When I was in high school, my dad purchased this old Victorian house he intended to flip. Before he got around to working on it, he'd let me hang out there with my friends. It seemed pretty cool, until the first and only night we decided to spend there. We set up an old TV and DVD player, and basically made the whole living room empty with a big lounge sleeping area with beanbags and blankets. It was getting pretty late, and we started to hear noises coming from upstairs. It sounded like scratching and rustling. Nothing too freaky, probably just mice or something. Well, anyway, one of the guys that was over decides that we should investigate. We head up the stairs and use our phones for lights, as there are no fixtures that work upstairs. We walk through the hall, getting closer and closer to the noise. We get to the huge built-in bookshelf at the end of the hall, and the noise somehow seems to be coming from behind. My friend starts knocking on the wall behind it to see if anything stirs up. We're still assuming some kind of animal or something is behind there. He starts monkeying around with the shelf and manages to pull off the entire thing, and it ends up being a hidden door behind the bookshelf. Of course we're giddy, because this is some shit that you only read about or see in films. We shine our phone into the room, and it's as if it was straight out of a horror movie. Filth everywhere, super old looking toys, cobwebs, and the creepiest part of it all, super deep scratches on the back of the bookshelf from fingernails. You could even see the dirty handprints that went along with them. It was the thing of nightmares, and we got the hell out of there. I spoke to a local neighbour a few weeks later who had lived nearby his entire life. He said that one of the previous owners of the property had a disabled son. They never saw much of him, but whenever he was out and about, he looked pretty beaten and tired. The dad was an arsehole and hated his kids. It got me wondering if he could have been the reason behind those scratches. Definitely one of the scariest things I've ever seen. This happened when Uber was still relatively new. My husband and I were stopping over in New York before heading to our temporary home of Poland. We had been living there for about a year, and although originally from Australia, we had spent the last year travelling through some of the more shady parts of Europe. So we thought we were generally prepared for any weird incidents. We were tired as we walked through JFK, ignoring everyone who wanted us to take their special taxi. Fortunately, I had Uber, and summoned a taxi as quick as possible. He arrived pretty quickly, got out and took our bags. I didn't really think anything of it. However, I insisted I take my own bag and tried to open the trunk. "No," he snapped at me. I was startled, but I said, "Okay, I'll just sit with it on my lap." My husband and I travelled light, so we only had one suitcase between us. "Can you open the trunk?" my husband asked the guy. "Otherwise there won't be any room for us." The guy already looked pissed, and all we were asking for is for him to do his job. I was already looking around to see if I could get another cab instead, because I really couldn't be bothered. "Fine," the guy snapped, and basically ripped the trunk open. I hadn't got in the car yet. It was kind of a paranoid thing that I did. I never got into a taxi alone as a result of some kidnapping stories in Greece of a similar nature. So I waited, and I saw what was in his trunk. It wasn't all over the flooring, just on one side. I instantly felt ill. It looked like blood. The spot was wet, and I stared blankly. With the dim light, I could just make out various other stains of similar but darker colours. I barely began to process it all until the suitcase was in and the trunk door was slammed shut. I was now wide awake. I didn't want to get into the Uber. Everything was wrong. This was a mistake. "What's the hold-up? Get in," the Uber guy yelled at us. I tried to get my husband's attention, but he was already in the back seat. If this were a horror movie, I would be screaming to myself, "Don't get in the cab." So I got into the Uber, with my bag on my lap. I clutched it as we spun around the corners, went sharply forward at brake slamming. I felt ill, and I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Was it real? Halfway through my haze, I realised this was not the way. I mean, far be it for me to tell the driver in their own city where the hell they're going. But I like to be prepared, and I like to know where I am. And he wasn't trying to mug us off, taking us the touristic scenic route. He was just going the wrong way. "You're going the wrong way," the words fell out of my mouth. The guy said nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. "What?" my husband asked. "We're going the wrong way." "Are we going the wrong way?" my husband asked. "We are going the wrong way," I repeated. My husband is not one to take shit from anyone. "Hey man, don't think you can screw with us. We're not paying you any more, so don't piss around and take us where we're going to, or I'm calling the cops." He had no idea why I was freaking out. I didn't care about the money. I just thought we were pawns in this crazed guy's master plan. We were going to swim with the fishes in the Hudson or something, because I was going crazy and my mind was wandering. There was blood in the trunk. Thoughts rushed through my head. Perhaps he was taking us to some serial killer warehouse with all his serial killer cab driver friends to slaughter us. The driver immediately slammed on the brakes at a set of lights. "I'm pretty sure this isn't an Uber," I muttered to myself. But the cab driver spoke up. "Do you see the sign?" "It is an Uber," he snapped. "Then why don't you do your job?" my husband snapped at him, without a second thought. Perhaps the guy thought it was too much trouble. One loudmouth Aussie bogan and his crazy wife, because now he turned around and started going the right way. We got to the hotel, and I made sure to check the trunk again, but it was darker now and I couldn't see anything clearly, except for lots of shredded rags with a deep rust colour staining them all. My first apartment after college was the upper half of an old house. My new roommate had just recently graduated, so he was in no rush to move in. I'd been living with my parents for the past year or so and needed out as soon as possible. So I brought a sleeping bag over with the last load of stuff on day one. No utilities, just camping out by myself in the living room. At some point during the night, I had a vivid dream that a killer with a knife was coming down the main hallway towards the door to the living room. Just as he was about to open the door though, I woke up terrified. I shook it off though, it was a dream, and I went back to sleep. I was talking to my roommate one morning a few months later, and he told me something that I found very strange. He had a weird dream the previous night. He had fallen asleep in the living room for the first time, and had a dream that a killer with a knife was coming down the main hallway towards the door to the living room. Just as the killer was about to open the door, my friend woke up. He spent the rest of the night in his own room, thoroughly creeped out. At that point, I told him about my dream for the first time, and we both thought it was pretty weird. A couple of months later, a friend needed a place to crash. He asked to stay on the couch for a night. Next morning, as we're all having breakfast together, he mentions that he had an odd dream. I asked him, was it a killer with a knife coming down the main hallway towards the door to the living room? My friend then added, and just as he was about to open the door, you woke up. The look of pure terror on our friend's face was astounding. I think we really need to look up the history of this house. I went to a high school that was built maybe 200 to 300 years ago. Me and my friends noticed these hatches that were about 6 feet off the floor next to the toilets. For context, the school was based around a quad, so there was a toilet down some stairs at each corner of the quad. Obviously we had to check these hatches out, so we did it during a drama lesson that we snuck out of. We got in there, and there was a corridor under the actual corridor, which was only about 5 to 4 feet tall, so we had to crawl through it. The corridor connected all the toilets, and there were vents on the top of the walls that were the skirting board level in the classroom, so we could watch lessons going on, which was pretty cool. There were tons of pipes and electrical wires, and other non-interesting shit you would expect, apart from in one corner of the quad though. The hatch for this one was locked from the inside. It looked like the pipes had all gone back into the wall, or stopped so that the wall was bare concrete slab, rather than bricks, which was odd. There was a small gap at the bottom of the wall that I could only just fit through. It was a struggle crawling under as we had our mobiles for torches, and I'm not the smallest of people. When we got through, it felt so much colder in this opening than it did in the corridor. The space was also much more spacious, and we could actually stand up. And also, the lights from our torches didn't light up the opposite side of the room. When we shone them over there, it was as if they weren't even turned on. The room smelled really bad, and I saw what looked like a decomposed cat, which was now just mostly bone and fur, at the side next to the wall closest to us. Freakier still though, there was a stone arch above where the cat was, with some red writing that I think was blood. It was a few years ago, but I vaguely remember it saying something along the lines of, "If you are found here, the school will expel you, but Lucifer shall do much worse." There were a few scratches in the wall, and some symbols that we thought were letters but we couldn't make them out. We instantly got the hell out of there, because we were shitting bricks at this point. It was a fairly prestigious school, so expulsion was probably the scariest thing that could happen to us. Nonetheless, we never ventured to that room again. I was in Tesco, a generic wholesale shop that we have here in England, and just innocently browsing the DVD section on my own. I was looking at the new releases, but not paying too much attention. My friend's parents were always away on holiday, and she was having a sleepover. Girls' night at hers, and had asked me to get a scary horror film for us to watch. Whilst looking, I heard, "So you like movies, eh?" I turned around and saw this guy who looked to be around 70 years old. He had greasy hair, but what struck me the most is that he was wearing socks and sandals. Yeah, that kind of made me smirk. I looked at him and just said, "Yep," and proceeded to carry on down the aisle. He followed me and started talking about films that he'd seen, what I should get, etc. I just replied, "Yeah, okay, whatever," and was reaching the end of the aisle. I'm a girl, 23, but must have looked younger, as I didn't have that much makeup on, and I have dark brown long hair. This old guy was still following me, and asking me where I'm going, do I have a boyfriend, do I like oral, and if I am alone. That was it for me. I turned around, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "Piss off, you hillbilly pervert," and walked off into the shop. I had gotten some ice cream and some popcorn and was now in my car driving to my friend's, singing along, badly, to the radio. I'm not so sure how long it had been there, but I noticed a silver pickup taking the same turns as I was. I was only doing around 50 in a 70 area, and they could have easily have overtaken me if they'd wanted to, but it stayed right behind me. My friend's turning past me, but I could take the next turning and double back on myself through the back roads. I didn't indicate, something I regret now and realised that this was very stupid of myself. I took the turning and drove as fast as I could to her house. and as I did, I saw the car take the same turning as me. She lives in a cul-de-sac area, and I parked my car down the road, not in front of hers, and ran into her garden. She always keeps the gate open, and I didn't know how long it would be before she'd have to open the main door, so I chose the garden. I locked the gate behind me and knocked on the back door. After being let in and being called a weirdo and peeping Tom, I got handed some wine. Not a minute later, there was a knock on the door. My friend opened it. It was the creepy guy from Tesco, with his silver car in the middle of the road. He was standing there saying something along the lines of, his daughter's car had broken down, and she had rung up from a house along this street, and he's here to pick her up. Is she here? He described me and what I was wearing. My friend said no, and shut the door in his face and locked it. I hadn't told them about the creepy guy, I'd only just got there. But she said there was something off about him, and wasn't my dad. No way I would have ever have known him. We saw through the curtain that he went to every other house in the cul-de-sac. He would get turned away, and then move on to the next one. We later found a piece of paper in a plastic sandwich bag left on my car windshield. It said, "Where did you go? I wasn't finished with you." A few years ago, I was leaving my grad school office late around 10 PM to catch the bus home. I walked from the university campus via a relatively busy, well-lit street to the main north-south road in my area of the city, 109th Street in Edmonton. I was waiting for the bus at a shelter. As it's the middle of winter, snowing, and a bit cold, the buses ran about every 15 minutes. So I wasn't worried nor nervous, just patiently waiting to get home. I was listening to my music with my headphones when I noticed a guy walk up to the shelter. I looked up at him briefly, did that little Canadian half-smiler acknowledgement, and went back to listening to my music. A few minutes passed, and I could hear him start talking to me. Well, I assumed it was me. I was the only one around. I looked up, and he was staring right at me, smiling a bit oddly, and speaking to me. I took out my headphones and said, "Excuse me?" And he just kept smiling and blathering on, asking me about my day, the weather, and what I like to do. I don't know what it is about me, but I am a perennial people pleaser. I don't like confrontation, and my main aim in life would be to keep the peace. So I answered a few of his questions politely and as non-specifically as I could, with one earbud still in my ear. He just kept blathering on, and I was sort of just nodding politely. This went on for about 10 minutes, and I just had this sinking feeling in my stomach about this guy. Something was just a little off, but enough to make me nervous. After about 10 minutes, I could see the bus rolling up, which was a huge relief for me. No one else had arrived at the bus stop, and I could see at least 10 to 15 people already on the bus, which was great. I got on and sat near the front, and the guy sat across from me so that we could keep talking. I had originally intended to head to my own house, but after this guy decided to be my personal parrot, I decided screw it. I'm going to my boyfriend's. I was still getting an uncomfortable feeling from this guy, so I decided I would push the bus stop button early to see what the guy did. The bus came to stop at my request, and when the guy got up, he didn't move. "Isn't this your stop too?" he asked. "Whoops," I said. "I must have hit the wrong stop." He looked at me and said, "Oh, that's funny. I mixed up mine too. This isn't my stop either," and sat back down. At this point, I'm pretty freaked out. I hit the stop button for the next stop and text my boyfriend to come and meet me on 109th. I got up to leave the bus once it stopped, and creepy dude followed me. I crossed the road, and he followed, still talking away at me and asking questions. Once I got to the other side of the road, I told him that I had to go, and that my boyfriend was meeting me. He looked irritated at the idea of my boyfriend, and tried to walk with me a bit more, but I stopped and told him that I was walking on alone. "Can I have your number?" he asked. I panicked. I just froze. I decided to give him almost my phone number. Just the last 4 digits scrambled. I read it off to him, said goodnight, and started walking away quickly. I had made it maybe 20 steps away, and I could hear someone jogging after me. "Hey!" I think there was a mix-up. I tried calling the number and it wasn't you. He jogged right up to me, and was still wearing that same smile as before. How weird. I grabbed my phone and pretended to check it for a missed call and quickly text my boyfriend. I told him I was terrified and that he needed to get here now. "So, what's your real number then?" he asked. I honestly didn't know what I could have done. I think I would have just given him my real number. I had no idea what to do. It was cold, it was like winter. It was dark in this little residential neighborhood, and I knew I couldn't outrun him. Luckily for me, my boyfriend came running up. He's 6'3" and somewhat imposing. I turned to the guy and say, "Have a good night," and jogged up to my boyfriend and just launched myself at him. I didn't look back at the creepy dude, but I did tell my boyfriend to make sure the doors were all locked and the windows all closed before we went to bed that night. So creepy bus dude, let's not meet again. About 18 months ago, my dad purchased a house that was a church in a past life. At some point the church closed, and the pastor continued living there for several years as he remodeled the church into a house, which eventually bankrupted him, and ended up with the home going into foreclosure. Almost every room in the house on the main floor had an exterior door, and there were a couple of different staircases that led into the basement. Several months after purchasing the house, whilst going up the stairs from the basement into the attached garage, my dad noticed a weird carpeted shelf on the side of the stairs. Looking more closely, he realized there was a handle, which when lifted up, revealed a hidden door that goes into another, small staircase. Once down the hidden stairs, he realized there was a hidden 8x10 secret room with concrete brick walls. The room is nearly soundproof, and you really wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it very closely. He jokes that he's going to use it for the storage space of all his food, water and weapons for the apocalypse. Makes me wonder though, what the church to use the room for? I was on vacation in a foreign state to see this festival. With the festival over and my phone dead, I start to freak out because I have no way of getting to my friend's house. Luckily, I spot some Ubers picking up some festival goers. Desperate, I plead with an Uber driver, telling them that no, I didn't call them through the app and I can't pay through credit card, but I do have cash. After about an hour or so, an Uber driver finally agrees to pick me up and do the transaction under the table, so to speak. I ask him ahead of time how much the ride will be, and fortunately, it's the exact amount of money that I have on me. We finally arrive to my destination, and the driver starts to ask for more money than what was agreed on. I tell him I don't have it, and I sit tensely in the back seat, not really sure what's going to happen next. I know restaurants have their patrons wash dishes if they can't pay. What could I possibly do to pay the money, I wonder? Finally, After a silence that seems to last forever, the Uber driver turns back to me and asks me in the most calm tone, "Well, you can always suck me off." Shocked, it takes me a couple of seconds to gather myself, and I say in the angriest, most panicked voice, "Excuse me," to scare him off. He just stares at me, and I realize that he could drive away with me at any point. I don't know what went through his mind, but he finally said, "Okay, I'll give you this ride for free." At that point, I race myself out of his car and wait until he drives about 2 or 3 feet away until I stick my middle finger up at him. I then start to cry like I've never cried before and realize just how lucky I got. A guy I used to work with told me this story. He used to be a bus driver, and one night he was on his final route before his shift ended. It was late at night, and he had no passengers when he left the bus station. After driving for a while and passing several empty shelters, he finally arrived at a stop with someone waiting in it. He pulled up, opened the door, and a scraggly young man stepped on board and went to take a seat. Lack of personal hygiene aside, nothing about this young man raised any alarm bells, and the driver closed the door and continued his route as usual. No one else got on the bus, and the young man did not get off. Eventually the driver arrived at the station, parked inside it, and waited for the young man to leave. Except he didn't. Concerned at this point, since they'd apparently had passengers overdose in the past, the driver left his cab and checked the bus. No sign of the young man on the lower deck, so he checked the top deck. Aside from the driver, the bus was completely empty. There was only one door, none of the windows could open, and none of them were damaged. There was no way the young man could have gotten off the bus without the driver seeing him, or without leaving any evidence. Yet, there was no sign of him. I was working at an 100-year-old abandoned farmhouse several years ago. My co-worker and I were told to find the well for the house, since they were thinking about developing the property. After looking for a while, we figured it might be in the old house. I grabbed my flashlight, and we headed in through a window that wasn't boarded up very well. The place was creepy. The second floor had a burnt goat carcass and pentagrams drawn in ash all over the walls. So that started the chills and goosebumps. We eventually made our way to the basement, where I almost fell into the very deep well at the end of the steps. I'm not sure how deep it was, but our 25-inch tape wouldn't hit the bottom. Anyway, my curiosity was still running wild, so we went searching around the basement. My co-worker noticed that one of the stone walls didn't make it all the way up to the ceiling, and it was probably a fake wall. Good call on his part. He boosted me over the wall, and I helped him climb over. The first room was empty and had nothing exciting, just dark, wet and cold. Looking around, there was another wall with an opening. I decided to go first, and I was boosted over the wall. My co-worker thought it would be funny to hang on to the flashlight for a while, whilst I stumbled in the dark. Finally, he tossed it over to me, and that's when I began freaking out. The room had chains built into the walls, with wrists and ankle shackles. The walls had scratch marks from nails, and I'm guessing that someone tried to escape. I lasted about 30 seconds in that room before I started to dash over both walls and the well, right out of the window we climbed through to get into that creepy house. I don't think it was just the shackles or the scratch marks that creeped me out. but the ice-cold chills that shot down my spine, like there was something truly evil lurking in that place. I see a lot of people interested in the deep web these days. Mainly teens. People talking about red doors and maybe other alternative names to things that they think they're real, but have never seen themselves. People question this every day and ask, are these red door events real? Do they really happen? They are very real indeed. Unfortunately, people with sick minds who get off on torture and other abnormal things go searching for these red doors/red rooms, and when they find them, they dish out great amounts of money just to control the show. I'm going to tell you about the experience I had when I was going onto the deeper end of the web. Some of you may have heard it already, but you can't actually access it without Tor. Now, Tor is infested with law enforcement. Red doors won't show up on the Onion any more than they used to. The only way that you can get to see a red door show is through the shadow web. And to get to the shadow web, you need an anonymous server which is called a Skix. It's like the new Tor, but without the law enforcement. The world is a much more cruel place nowadays in the cyber world. As a recently retired FBI agent who specialized in cybercrimes all around the world, I'm here to share a story of what I saw on one of my last cases before I retired. The case was never closed and got passed to the agent who replaced me. This was 4 months ago. I was working on a case that had been opened up through an anonymous complaint we had received online. The complaint was lengthy and in great detail described and mentioned many acts of torture beyond of what I had seen in my time in the agency. The tipster had sent screenshots of what they saw one night whilst digging deep onto the deep web. They explained how they had been a regular on the deep web, but that everything was dying out due to the LE that they wanted, so they needed to dig deeper, and they found the shadow web. The process of becoming a member of the shadow web was lengthy. The person claimed that it took them up to 2 weeks before they were granted access after paying. Finally though, the email they were expecting came in, and they were granted access after installing Skix. This was the new software that would allow them access to the shadow web servers. Little did they know what they were getting themselves into though. I can't give you too many details though, as the person who sent the information was murdered in their home a few weeks later. But this is where I will mention my experience as part of a personal investigation. I was given a link to the shadow web by the recently deceased, with permission from my boss. I was able to sit down and proceed and took the security precautions and paid the fee. It took the shadow web admin 2 days to send the email allowing me access. In the email, they prompted me to join as many as 4 live sessions that were going on throughout the week. One of them was called Sharkbait, another one was called Shit Cereal, and the other 2 are too gross to mention. The shadow web entrance that I was given was a portal to about 10 other websites through the shadow web. The websites didn't have names. They were named by numbers in a 1 to 10 list, and there were about 100 other websites on the bottom, but mainly they were all under construction. On the main page it showed the times, the dates, and the 4 shows that they were going to be broadcasting live on the shadow web through a stream. They were archives that began on March the 4th, 2015 and ended on August 23rd. These archives were of previous live streams that had already happened. I decided to take a look. The one that I chose was called Salted Snail. I didn't really know what to expect before clicking it. Judging by the name, I thought there had to be a snail involved. There wasn't. I clicked the link. It took me to a brown page with an advert and a video behind the ad. The advert started with a clown laughing. Then he says, "Not so fast. You'll have to go through me before you want to see what's to come." He reminded me of Captain Spaulding. He had several heads in the background, and his face was painted and smeared. His clothes were splattered with bloodstains. In the ad, he encouraged viewers to join one of the next sessions, to pay the fee, and to see the fun unfold, and that they were in full control of what happened to the sadistic victims. He then looked closely at the camera and said, "It's going to be one hell of a show." And the advert ended. The video was now available to play, and it was titled Salted Snail. It began with no credits. You see the clown again walking out from behind a white curtain that appeared to have either fecal matter or old blood smeared all over it, with a light behind. His face appears and is painted. He is naked and walks out of the curtain chuckling to himself and smiling. He then says the show is scheduled to stream for 15 minutes, so he has to stick to schedule because he is very, very hungry and has not eaten in the past 2 days. He then flashes his ribs at the camera. He wasn't that skinny, and then he asks everyone watching if they're ready for the show. He then chuckles and says, "I'll be right back." He goes behind the curtain and rolls out a black barrel and places it in front of the camera. He then walks around the barrel, knocking all around it with his fist as if he's knocking on a door, and then kicks it hard with his heel. You hear something in the barrel, and then he grabs what seems like a flat-headed screwdriver and pries open the barrel. You see a head full of hair as the lid opens. A girl sitting there alive. He then yells at her in Chinese to stand up. She can barely stand. Her body is so soggy, from what I assume is the effect of being in that barrel for days. He looks at the camera and says, "Doesn't she look delicious?" Delicious as cake. The girl had her hands tied up behind her mouth and was bound with multiple layers of cloth. She looked too weak to scream, too weak to escape or even attempt. She just stood there for what seemed to be as if she were accepting her own death. Then the clown went behind the curtain and came back with a knife and a razor. He then got in front of the camera and said, "I love me Chinese food. It's dinner time." The girl then turned to him and looked at him as he nodded at her and said, "Oh yes, it's time." Her eyes opened wide. She tried to scream, but she couldn't. He then teased her, poking at her with a knife. She began to bleed instantly from the poking as she was extremely soggy. He then showed off the little razor blade and proceeded to cut little squares on her shoulder as if he were cutting a little piece of cake. Pretty soon, he was at the other shoulder, then her chest, breast and stomach. The scene was extremely gorish and violent, almost as if filleting a fish. By the time he was finished with the body, he had a plate filled with her skin and tissue, what seemed to be a plate full of soggy skin. But the girl was still alive. Her body looked like it had been eaten by piranhas. The only thing that remained were her breasts and her face and hair. Then he took the plate behind the curtain and brought back another plate. He then looks at the camera and says, "Well, look at that. Doesn't she look great? You can see that she may have lost a couple of pounds, huh?" He then winks at the camera and begins to laugh, and proceeds to slice off the girl's ears and lips. What looks now like a mutilated body that is still alive left me wondering what he had done to other people in the past. I was enraged and extremely disturbed by what I had seen. The finale showed the clown coming out of the curtain with 2 containers of salt. He then poured the salt off over her body where her skin had been cut off. He poured a good amount on her ears and lips too. The girl suffering, hardly moving, but still somewhat standing. He then looks at the camera and says, "I bet you thought I was going to kill her, didn't you? But I'm not a murderer." He then pushes her head back down into the barrel and closes the lid. He looks at the camera and says, "Stay tuned to the next episode." The camera then shows him putting a white tablecloth over the barrel and placing the plate full of soggy flesh on it. He lights a candle, grabs a knife and fork, and starts eating the flesh whilst chuckling away at himself. The screen then floods with the words, "Till the next episode," over and over, with some circus music playing in the back. The camera then dims, and it shows him there, eating and laughing away. The black screen shows the word, "Offline." I immediately became concerned for the girl. She was Asian. The clown clearly looked American, or sounded American at least. He really resembled Captain Spaulding from The Devil's Rejects or House of 1,000 Corpses. I am assuming that is what he was trying to act like anyway. I contacted my chief and had a personal meeting with him and explained everything that I had seen. He then laughed and said, "Oh, you've seen him too, eh? That clown on the internet. He's been around since the late 90s doing these shows. He seems to buy women off the black market and then torture the shit out of them." He then shrugs his shoulders and says, "We don't know who he is or where he's located. The Chinese help keep him anonymous, probably because he buys their stock." To me, this was something new. As an agent who dealt with homicides and piracy, I had never encountered nor seen anything like this. I am now retired, and I thought I would share this story with you. Everyone should know, the deep web is deep and free, but the shadow web, that is somewhere that you do not want to go to. Beware. This happened ages ago, when I used to babysit. I was maybe 13 at the time, living in the countryside, and was babysitting most of the children on my street, which was around 20 houses. This particular neighbour would love to go out on Wednesday, because there would always be this Latin dance class that was going on in a nearby bar. So I was used to babysitting for her and knew that she'd always come back very late. That specific night, the oldest of the 3 was a little difficult and didn't want to go to sleep. I struggled putting him into bed, and afterwards was quite tired. I studied my maths a little, and around midnight decided to take a nap until the kid's mum came back. A few minutes after falling asleep, I hear someone frantically knocking on the door trying to open it. It was the neighbour with her 2 young children. It was winter and we easily had 3 feet of snow and temperatures outside that must have been around -21 degrees C or -5 Fahrenheit. The kids only had their pajamas on and an unzipped jacket. She was wearing jeans, a wool shirt and winter boots. I could see genuine fear in her eyes as I struggled unlocking the door. I panicked and had her walk all the way round the house to the patio door. When she got in, she quickly told me to bring all the children downstairs and turn off all the lights, and to not answer the door to anyone. The kids kept asking, "Who is Daddy going to kill? Who is Daddy going to kill?" And she kept muting and saying nothing was going to happen, and then she left. I woke all the kids up and brought them into the playroom in the basement and asked them to play silently. The oldest, who hadn't been asleep for very long, was asking what was going on, and I kept telling him it was a special occasion where he could come and play late with his neighbour's friends. I calmed down the two other children, telling them that no one was going to die. But in my mind, my time had come. I could see myself being shot whilst trying to protect these children. I was trying to figure out how to stay alive, or at the very least how to keep them alive. I wasn't trying to be a hero, but I was trying to convince myself that if it came down to that, I would have to try and protect them. I called 911, but started shaking and crying so much I didn't know what to do. It was an answering machine asking if I wanted the cops or an ambulance or firefighters. I called my mum, quickly told her what was going on, and she called the cops and joined me. As she got in the driveway, the neighbour's husband was walking up the street with a huge axe. My mum got into the house, locked the door and cracked open a window, and asked what was going on whilst he approached the house. He asked her to come out and confront him, thinking it was his wife. My mother then explained to him that she was the babysitter's mother and came after getting a worried 13-year-old's call. He then asked us to give him his wife, but we didn't know where she was. He argued a little with my mum, but she was so calm it calmed him down. I still admire her for that night. After about 15 minutes of arguing, he walked back home carrying his axe, and a few seconds later, his wife knocked on the patio door behind the house and came in. She was crying and apologizing to my mother for the whole situation. She thought her neighbor was home, not the babysitter. My mother asked me to go check on the kids while she was taking care of the wife. A few minutes later, 2 police cars arrived and they came in and spent time with the wife asking tons of questions. Then me, and then my mother. In the meantime, the woman I was babysitting for arrived, and they interviewed her as well. They asked me and my mother if we were ready to go to court if the woman pressed charges against her husband, but surprisingly, she never did. Turns out that she had just announced to her firefighter husband that she was sleeping with her boss in order to get a raise because they were struggling financially. He got his firefighting axe and said that he was going to kill the bastard, but she wanted to stop him. That's why she brought the kids and left. I was always scared of him after that, and whenever I saw his children, I would check if they had any signs of violence. But they moved around 6 months later, and we moved 2 years after. I used to live in downtown Greenville, Texas in the 1990s. Greenville used to be a thriving cotton town in the 1950s. But the population has declined and downtown is mostly abandoned. My friends and I explore the abandoned buildings for fun, being urban explorers. Anyway, there was a multi-story building that used to have Mexican restaurants downstairs in the 70s, but it had been abandoned since then. The bottom of the building had been locked up tight, but we were given access to the roof from a neighbour's building, and finally got inside the building that way. Inside were some old offices, nothing much of interest, but I noticed a crack in the wall behind some peeling wallpaper. There was a door-sized sliding panel that had been papered over decades before. Behind it was an apartment that would have been used for housing by the people who owned the business downstairs, and it was largely untouched. I found newspapers there from the 1940s, and the last one was dated 1947. So weird that this place hadn't been touched in over 60 years. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Well done for making it all the way to the end of the video. It's quite a feat. I'm not sure, but I think we may have just hit 39,000 subscribers, which is amazing. So close to 40 now. So thank you everyone for your support and viewership. Honestly, every single one of you means the world to me. I'm still trying to see if we can hit 50k for Halloween. I'm going to try and do some special stuff in October for a spook fest. Maybe a week of hour-long videos? I suppose it really depends on what you guys want. So let me know down below. And remember that if you want to share a story, you just need to submit it as a text post on my Reddit page or send it to me via email. Both links can be found in the description. And if you enjoyed today's video, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe to not miss your daily dose of horror. And of course, all comments and likes really help with the algorithm. If you would like to do something truly incredible today to help support the channel, you can visit my Patreon. You can find the link in the description, as well as find the links to my social media. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.